Hello all, this is Dr. Alsip, and in this video, we will be discussing the different parts of a long bone. So many of these terms and these structures that we're going to discuss are going to be brought up in subsequent videos. So do try to make sure that we get our bearings here in this area. So there will be different parts of the actual bone, but there will also be accessory structures that we need to be aware of that are either attached to the bone or very closely associated. So as always, after viewing and taking notes of the lecture, I would return to these learning objectives and make sure you can write these in your own words. All right, so let's begin with just the term long bone in terms of what that means. And it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. A long bone is going to be longer than it is wide, and you'll have these very closely associated with the appendages or the limbs. So we're looking here over here, we're looking at a humerus. Over here, this is a femur. These are the longest of the long bones of the upper limb and the lower limb. And there's really two major parts of a long bone. You will have the diaphysis, which you can see here labeled. This is also referred to as the shaft or the body. So this is really where that long comes in. This is the longest portion of the bone. And then on the ends, you will have the epiphysis or the epiphyses if you're talking about more than one. And these will be located on the ends of the long bone. So often you'll have an epiphysis associated with the proximal as well as the distal end of the bone. Sometimes you'll only have one epiphysis. Sometimes you'll have more than two epiphyses. But in general, usually you'll have one proximal and one distal. As you can see here in this cross section, the epiphysis is going to be made up of mostly spongy bone with an outer layer of compact bone on the end for protection. A more conceptually difficult region is the metaphysis. And this literally is a region, okay? So this is the region or the region between an epiphysis and the diaphysis. It is just going to be that space in between. And what the epiphysis or what the metaphysis actually is composed of will differ quite wildly in terms of age, in terms of individuals. So one of the things that you will find in a growing bone is a growing bone in terms of length is what's called an epiphyseal or a growth plate. And you don't really see an example of that here on this image. But what this is literally like a plate-like structure that's composed of hyaline cartilage. And since it's actually this hyaline cartilage is actually attaching the epiphysis to the diaphysis in a bone that's still growing in length, this is actually an example of a joint. Specifically, this is a synchondrosis, which is a type of cartilaginous joint. And what happens here at this epiphyseal plate is that the plate will actually grow, so the cartilage will actually grow, and eventually it will be replaced by bone, allowing for the bone to grow in terms of length. So very important in terms of during bony growth. Now, eventually, that hyaline cartilage will be completely replaced by bone. And what you will have left is what's referred to as an epiphyseal line. You can see that here. I'm going to just kind of fill in the line right here. You can see an epiphyseal line in a young adult. Eventually, with age, that line does appear to kind of occlude, and you don't see that. So it's really kind of a bony joint in this region. Now, on the ends of long bone, so associated with the ends of those epiphyses on the ends of the bone, you will have a thin layer of hyaline cartilage. So you can see a little bit of it there. You can see a little bit of it right here. And this cartilage is not involved with bone growth. So that's an important differentiation here. Instead, articular cartilage is going to be associated with synovial joints for the most part. And it's really an added layer of shock absorption and protection to the bone. But this cartilage is not what's actually attaching the bone to another bone. So it's not what's forming the joints. It's a component of the joint, but it's not the part that's actually the connective tissue actually attaching the bones. Also important to note in terms of the articular cartilage is that it is mostly avascular, meaning that if there's damage to this cartilage, this is very slow to heal, unlike what we have with bone. And so it's typically articular cartilage that's going to be affected in osteoarthritis. And we'll talk more about that when we get to talking about the joints. Articular cartilage is actually a remnant of endochondral ossification, which is the major means through which the bones develop in a cartilage model. So you'll have cartilage throughout the entirety of this region, eventually replaced by bone, and that's all that's left of that process are these remnants of this articular cartilage. Next, we have the periosteum. The periosteum is going to surround the bone, almost the entirety of the bone. It's a connective tissue layer that is going to be found everywhere around the bone, except where there's articular cartilage and except where tendons and ligaments actually are going to insert on the bone. But pretty much everywhere else, you'll have the periosteum. It gives that kind of shiny appearance to the bone. Now, it's actually composed of two layers. Oftentimes, these types of tissues will have two layers. This outer layer, as you can see here, does exactly what a good outer layer should do, which is really going to protect the bone. It's going to serve as this outer fibrous layer. It's going to be composed of mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. And also, you're going to have an inner osteogenic or cellular layer. You can see that here. And that is going to be important in terms of appositional growth or growth in, on the outside of the bone or bone width. And so you'll have your osteogenic cells in there. You'll have osteoblasts associated with this inner layer of the periosteum. The periosteum, you can't really, no, I guess you can't really see it well here, but that periosteum is literally going to be attached to the bone. It'll send certain fibers that are going to interweave with the matrix of the bone that's referred to as these penetrating or perforating or Sharpie's fibers. You'll hear those three terms. That's the actual means by which the periosteum attaches to the bone. All right, now we're moving inside the bone. So periosteum was surrounding the outside. Now we're moving inside. And one of the most prominent things that you'll see when you're looking at the inside of a long bone or the diaphysis is the medullary or the marrow cavity. Medulla literally means marrow. And when we're talking about an adult bone, this is going to contain yellow bone marrow, so very important in terms of triglyceride storage, as well as allow for neurovasculature to travel throughout the bone. If you were to remove those structures, it would appear completely hollow in that region. So that is not only important in terms of triglyceride storage and neurovasculature, but it also really reduces the weight of the bone. Think if this whole area was just completely filled in with compact bone, that would make that bone quite a bit heavier. That could affect movement, but it would certainly affect energy consumption associated with movement. And then the last structure I want to talk about is the endosteum. So endo means within. So we are talking about this thin membrane of cells. This is literally just cells with a little bit of connective tissue to kind of keep them together. And so this is found within bone. You will have most of the bony cell types associated with the endosteum. So you see the large osteoclast here. You'll have some osteogenic cells. You'll certainly have osteoblasts as well. So most of the bone cell types are going to be associated with the endosteum. And you'll have the endosteum lining the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity. And then you'll also see it associated with the trabeculae of bone as well. So you can see that endosteum surrounding the trabeculae that are within the bone. All right, excellent. So those are the major parts of a long bone. And so let's take a moment to review with a question. And as always, I want you to pause the video, take time to answer this on your own. And so the question here is, articular cartilage is typically located on what part of a long bone? So pause if needed, but if you're ready to answer, I hope that you went with B as the correct answer. So it is the articular cartilage is going to be found on the ends of long bones. Those ends are going to typically be associated with an epiphysis that's going to form part of, be associated with articulating bones and form the joint. The diaphysis is going to be the shaft or the body of the long bone, so it's not going to have articular cartilage, and that medullary cavity is actually within the diaphysis, so also wrong. The metaphysis is a little trickier. You remember the metaphysis is the region between an epiphysis and the diaphysis, and you can actually have an epiphyseal plate in the metaphyseal region, and that is composed of hyaline cartilage. So both the epiphyseal plate as well as articular cartilage are made up of hyaline cartilage, but they are located in different regions as well as having very different functions as well. So metaphysis, while a little bit trickier, not the right answer either. And lastly, you have the periosteum, which is going to surround almost all of the long bone, except for where there's articular cartilage or insertions of ligaments or tendons. So also not correct. All right, most excellent. Thank you for your time and attention here. And as always, reach out if you have any questions.